The decision to wait was made over breakfast. On the morning of September 14, 1902, the Parker expedition, 11 men engaged in geological survey work along the upper reaches of the Clearwater River in northern Idaho, gathered in their base camp to discuss the weather. The air had grown noticeably colder during the night. A light snow had dusted the higher ridges, but the calendar still showed 2 weeks before the mountain passes typically became impassable, and the men had 3 days of mapping work remaining in a valley they would not visit again for years, perhaps ever. The expedition leader, Dr. William Parker, a geologist from the University of California, noted in his field journal that the group discussed an early departure but concluded the work was too valuable to abandon prematurely. His assistant, James Holbrook, wrote to his sister that same morning, a letter later found in camp, saying they would finish properly and descend in good order by the 18th at the latest. They were 23 miles from the nearest settlement, a logging camp called Ferris Station. The route back followed a well-marked trail that had been used by survey teams for a decade. In summer, the journey took a day and a half. In early autumn, perhaps 2 days. The men carried sufficient provisions for a week. Their horses were healthy. Several members of the party had extensive wilderness experience. Nothing in the historical record suggests panic or serious concern. The discussion that morning lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The group voted. 7 men favored finishing the survey. 4 suggested leaving immediately. Parker, as expedition leader, sided with the majority. A notation in the camp logbook, written by the expedition's cook, a man named Samuel Cord, reads, "Dr. P. says we have time. Weather watch begins." Beneath this, in different ink, possibly added later that same day, "Could still turn back if we chose." They chose to stay. The rhythm of those 3 days appears, from surviving documents, entirely ordinary. The men rose each morning before dawn. They ate oatmeal and bacon. They packed surveying equipment, transits, measuring chains, specimen hammers, field notebooks, and moved out into the valley in teams of 2 or 3. Dr. Parker supervised the work with what his colleagues described as customary precision. Samples of rock were labeled and stored. Measurements were recorded in duplicate. The group returned to camp each evening before full darkness, prepared dinner, and reviewed the day's findings by lamplight. James Holbrook's letters, written but never sent, describe the work as tedious but necessary. He mentions that the weather remained cool but clear through the 15th and 16th. On the evening of the 16th, he noted a drop in temperature and a peculiar stillness, but added that no one seems worried. The reassurances came from several directions. First, there was the calendar. The men carried a printed almanac that predicted the first major snowfall in that region would not occur until late September, perhaps early October. Dr. Parker referenced this document in a conversation recorded by another expedition member, a surveyor named Thomas Milliken. "The data supports our timeline," Parker said. "We are well within safe margins." Second, there was precedent. 2 of the men, Samuel Cord and a packer named George Lyle, had been part of a similar survey in 1898 that had remained in the high country until September 22nd without incident. Lyle mentioned this multiple times. His confidence was noted by others. Third, there was the simple fact that nothing alarming had happened yet. The nights were cold, yes, but the days remained clear. The trail remained passable. The horses grazed without difficulty. One expedition member, a young geologist named Arthur Penn, wrote in his field notes that the mountains felt no different than they had a week prior. Danger, when it is abstract, does not compel action. The men worked carefully and without haste. They spoke of what they would do when they returned. Warm beds, proper meals, letters home. Arthur Penn mentioned looking forward to seeing his fiancée in Sacramento. James Holbrook planned to submit his survey notes for publication. Dr. Parker discussed a follow-up expedition the next summer. On the evening of September 16th, the group completed its final transect. The work was finished. Dr. Parker announced they would pack the camp the following morning and begin the descent. There was, according to Thomas Milliken, a sense of satisfaction in the camp that night. The men played cards. Someone produced a flask of whiskey. The mood was described as quietly celebratory. No one suggested leaving that night. The idea was not even raised. The assumption, shared, unspoken, and entirely reasonable given the information available, was that one more night would be fine. The snow began sometime after midnight. It did not announce itself. There was no wind, no thunder, no dramatic shift. The flakes fell softly and steadily, accumulating in silence. By the time the men woke on the morning of September 17th, the camp was blanketed under 7 inches of fresh powder. The sky remained gray and low. Snow continued to fall. Dr. Parker's journal entry for that morning is brief. Unexpected accumulation, departure delayed until conditions improve. The decision to wait once again did not feel reckless. The snow was heavy, but the temperature had not dropped severely. The horses could still move, though with difficulty. The men discussed setting out immediately despite the conditions, but the consensus, again reached through a group discussion, was that traveling in active snowfall on a trail now obscured with loaded pack animals presented unnecessary risk. Better, they reasoned, to wait for the snow to stop. Then they could assess the trail and move efficiently. Perhaps the weather would clear by afternoon, perhaps by the next morning. Thomas Milliken wrote, "We are in no immediate danger. Provisions are adequate. Morale is steady. The prudent course is to wait." The snow did not stop. By midday on the 17th, accumulation had reached 14 inches. The temperature began to drop. Dr. Parker called another meeting. The group now faced a choice: attempt to leave immediately in worsening conditions, or wait one more night in the hope that the storm would pass. The vote this time was closer. 6 men favored leaving. 5 favored waiting. Dr. Parker, after a long silence, sided again with caution. "We risk the horses and the equipment if we move now," he said, according to Arthur Penn's notes. "We wait until morning." There is no indication that this decision was controversial. The men who voted to leave did not protest. The logic seemed sound. The camp was secure. The men were dry and fed. One more night seemed manageable, but the storm did not pass. On the morning of September 18th, the snow depth exceeded 2 feet. The trail was no longer visible. The temperature had dropped below freezing and continued to fall. The horses, exposed and anxious, had stopped eating. Dr. Parker wrote, "Conditions now require departure regardless of risk. We begin preparations." It was already too late. The group set out mid-morning on the 18th, moving slowly through deep, wet snow. Progress was measured in yards. The horses struggled. The men, carrying heavy packs, broke trail in shifts. By early afternoon, they had covered less than 2 miles. The cold had become severe. One of the younger men, Arthur Penn, showed early signs of frostbite on his hands. At approximately 3 o'clock, one of the pack horses broke through crusted snow and injured its leg. The animal could not continue. Dr. Parker ordered the group to halt and redistribute the load. The process took over an hour. By the time they resumed, daylight was fading. They made camp that night 5 miles from their original base, still 18 miles from Ferris Station. James Holbrook wrote in his journal, "We should have left on the 16th. It was the last entry he made. The search party found the first body on October 9th, 1902. It was Samuel Cord, the expedition cook, discovered beneath a makeshift shelter of pine branches approximately 9 miles from the base camp. He had been dead for at least 2 weeks. The county coroner's report listed the cause of death as exposure and hypothermia. Personal effects found on the body included a small Bible, a pocket watch that had stopped at 2:14, and a brief note written on the back of a supply list. Waited too long. Over the following 3 weeks, search teams recovered the remains of all 11 men. The bodies were found scattered along a 6-mile stretch of the trail in various states of preparation. Some had attempted to build fires. Others had tried to construct shelters. One man, George Lyle, had written a detailed account of the group's deterioration, noting that the cold came faster than we thought possible, and that we believed we had time. None of the men had starved. The provisions, found largely intact, would have sustained them for days longer. What killed them was cold, amplified by exhaustion, wet clothing, and the gradual failure of the body's ability to generate heat. Dr. Parker's body was found last on October 28th, less than 3 miles from Ferris Station. He had been attempting to go for help. His field journal, recovered from his coat, contained a final entry dated September 22nd. I miscalculated. The margin was smaller than I understood. The investigation that followed was thorough and polite. The university convened a panel to review Dr. Parker's decisions. The panel's report, published in February 1903, concluded that no single error of judgment can be identified, but rather a sequence of reasonable decisions made under incomplete information, each of which compounded into catastrophic delay. Meteorological records confirmed that the storm of September 17th to 20th, 1902, was unusually early and unusually severe. The region had not experienced comparable snowfall in mid-September for over 30 years. The almanac the expedition carried was technically accurate, based on historical averages. Dr. Parker had not been reckless. He had been unlucky. But the panel also noted that opportunities for earlier departure existed and were not taken. A logger at Ferris Station, interviewed in October, stated that his crew had left the high country on September 10th because the air felt wrong. He could not explain what he meant by this, but he had trusted the feeling. He survived. Families of the deceased asked questions that had no satisfying answers. Why had the group not left on the 14th when the first snow fell? Why not on the 16th when the work was finished? Why not on the night of the 16th, even in darkness, rather than waiting for morning? The answer, embedded in every document, every letter, every journal entry, was the same. They believed there was time. James Holbrook's unsent letters were delivered to his sister in November. In one, written on September 15th, he described the mountains as beautiful and entirely safe. Arthur Penn's fiancée received his field notebook. On the last page, dated September 16th, he had written, "Looking forward to being home soon. No cause for concern." These were not lies. They were assessments made in good faith, based on experience and data, and the entirely human assumption that disaster announces itself clearly and early. It does not. The university erected a small monument near Ferris Station in 1904. The inscription reads, "In memory of the Parker expedition, 11 men of science lost to the mountains, September 1902. It does not say what killed them. It does not need to. The Parker expedition disappears from public record after 1905. A few brief mentions appear in geological journals, a footnote in a later survey report, a passing reference in a history of the Clearwater region. But the story, such as it was, faded quickly. There were no villains, no mysteries, no dramatic failures, just a group of men who waited a few days longer than they should have and died because of it. What remains are the documents. Archival researchers revisiting the case more than a century later find the same quiet detail repeated across journals, letters, and reports. The men did not panic. They did not make wild errors. They consulted data. They discussed options. They voted. They acted at every stage with what appeared to be reasonable caution. And yet, the window closed so quietly that they did not hear it shut. Weather in the mountains does not negotiate. It does not provide warnings proportional to the danger it carries. A storm in mid-September is meteorologically identical to a storm in late October, but one kills and the other does not, purely as a function of timing and expectation. The men of the Parker expedition expected time because they had always had it before. They expected the mountains to behave according to averages, to precedent, to almanacs. They were trained scientists. They understood data. They understood risk. What they did not understand was that safety is not a guarantee extended by the calendar. It is a margin that narrows without notice. On the evening of September 16th, that margin was still open. The trail was clear. The horses were strong. The weather, though cooling, had not yet turned. Leaving that night would have been inconvenient. It would have meant abandoning comfort, truncating the work, moving in partial darkness. It would also have meant survival. But convenience is a powerful narcotic. The assumption that we can always leave tomorrow is seductive precisely because it is so often true, until it is not. Dr. William Parker was 41 years old when he died. He had led expeditions for over a decade. He had published extensively. He was cautious, methodical, and experienced. He did not take reckless chances. He simply believed, as did his men, that one more night would be fine. The historical record does not judge him harshly. The university panel did not assign blame. His colleagues spoke of him with respect. He made a miscalculation, not a mistake. But the 11 men still died. In the archives, there is a letter written by James Holbrook's sister, dated November 1902, addressed to the university. She asks a single question. At what point did my brother know he was not coming home? No one could answer her. The journals suggest that realization came gradually over days as cold deepened and progress slowed, and the men began to understand that the thing they had thought impossible, that they might not make it out, was happening. There was no single moment of clarity, just a slow, quiet recognition that the margin had closed. Arthur Penn's last written words found in his notebook read, "Should have left sooner." 3 words, no drama, no rage, just a simple, belated understanding. The Parker expedition is not a story of chaos or panic. It is a story of delay, of reasonable men making reasonable decisions that, in aggregate, proved fatal, of a window that remained open just long enough to seem permanent, then closed without ceremony. There are no lessons here that feel satisfying, no clear errors to avoid. The men were not foolish, they were not arrogant, they were simply human, and humans are skilled at convincing themselves that urgency can wait. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot. The mountains do not care which. On September 14th, 1902, the Parker expedition had time to leave. On September 16th, they still had time. On the morning of September 17th, before the snow began, they had time. By the afternoon of September 18th, they did not. The difference between those days was 72 hours and a quiet decision to wait. That is all. That is enough.